Hello and welcome to this episode of BIC Streams as part of the Young Adult series at the Bangalore International Center. Today, we will be discussing a very interesting topic titled Young, Free, and Political, in which we will be understanding the youth's political differences, opinions, thoughts, and just trying to understand where we stand on politics in general. As part of today's episode of the Young Adult series, keeping in tune to the reason behind hosting this series, all our panelists are in the age category of 17 to 22 years old, and they're from across the political spectrum, and they'll be discussing a couple of issues that they think are pertinent and should be discussed on such a platform. Our panelists for today are Rishika Arora. She is the CEO of the Young India Foundation. We have Anjali Surana, the founder of Full Stop. We have Sumukh B. Ram, a law student and the founder of Nyayartha. And we have Rahul Singh, who's a professional provocateur. We also have Tia Puvaya, who is the moderator, who is the founder of Aurat Arogya and will be the moderator for today's session. Over to you, Tia.
Thank you, Sanjit. As you said, I think we've got a very interesting panel that spreads across the political spectrum, and I'm really excited to see how this debate goes today and where it takes us. So to start off with, I'm going to call Sumukh up to give us just some opening statements and about where he stands.
Yeah. First of all, good morning to everyone. Thank you, Tia. So as a young political activist, I would classify myself as a conservative, first of all. But I do believe that there are underlying layers of what politics mean to me. So it's not a unequivocal, one unidimensional view of how politics works in India. According to me, you need to have multiple layers. And for that, I would like to divide my views into cultural right and economic right. So one aspect would be that I focus more on development and wealth creation. So I do not believe in, say, the direct benefit transfers or say the subsidiary cultures, which would help people get money directly into their hands. It's a short-term benefit, sure, but doesn't help in long-term gains. So those are my economic views. But on the cultural right as well, I do believe that India traditionally has a lot of religion and culture which has played an intrinsic part of its society. Most of our kingdoms or monarchies formed on these basis of communities or societies based on religion or culture or your ethnicity. So I think that link has still been strong through us even after colonization and even after independence, perhaps. So I think that is an important factor in deciding how Indian politics works, and also in identifying yourself as to who you are after an Indian. So I think that that's an important part according to me as well. So yeah.
Thank you. Just before we move on to the next panelist, we have a Q&A box. It's at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to ask questions. We will be answering them at the end of the session. I'd say we'd leave about the last half an hour for questions, so please feel free to ask as many as you want. But now can we call Anjali to give her views and where she stands?
Thank you, Tia, and thank you, BIC, for having me here today. Let me start by agreeing with the conservative here. And let me say that I agree that, of course, there are a lot of underlying layers to politics, which is why when I would like to state my standing, I would like to avoid putting any labels, because I feel like today politics is, especially not politics, but when these labels are extremely tribalized and compartmentalized, and I obviously have different stances on different issues. So, but at the same time, when it comes to, I think, social values and culture, I'd call myself a progressive. For example, I'm pro-choice. I ardently support LGBTQ plus rights and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the economic development of the nation, I'd say I'm a centrist / slightly right-leaning. And now I will disagree with the conservative here. And I will say that I do believe that India, the that Ambedkar's India, that Nehru's India, that Gandhi's India is a secular country. So, which is very interesting because in 1928, Winston Churchill said that India is merely a geographic location. Okay, it's as much as a country as the equator, right? But that's because he couldn't fathom the diversity that India upholds, right? It is my belief that no other country in the world embraces the extraordinary group of ethnic groups, the mutually incomprehensible languages, the varieties of climates and topography, the diversity of religions and cultural practices, and the range of levels of economic development that India upholds. And I think that is our interpretation of secularism. In France, for example, secularism for them is absolutely having no show of religion, right? For example, in their government places, you were not allowed to wear a turban, for example, or a hijab, right? Because they don't want any show of religion. But for India, what I think for us, our interpretation of secularism is, as cliche as it sounds, unity and diversity. So I think India has been built on the ethos of secularism and should remain so. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think you brought up some very valid points, which we will get into when we start discussing. But next, can we have Rishika give us her stance, please?
Thank you, Tia, and hi everyone. It's an honor to be joined by such dynamic young people, and thank you, BIC, for having me. So I'm Rishika. I'm currently a student pursuing politics, philosophy, and economics. And when it comes to identifying a sort of political, social, economic label, like Sumuk and Anjali said, and I agree, there's so much nuance to politics. When the moment we start categorizing and the moment we start sticking to a sort of particular strict ideology, we risk ourselves into falling into dogmatic beliefs, right? And so much of politics comes from discourse and connection, and that's why we're having this panels to listen to the other side. That being said, I agree with Anjali when she says that she's a progressive. I tend to see myself leaning left in a lot of beliefs. I support economic welfare for the masses. I believe in community-based enfranchisement projects. I believe in a political left that cares for those who are disenfranchised by the state, and the empowerment based on ground up advocacy, meaning we begin from the grassroots and then go up. I lean progressive in terms of I support the LGBT community. I am pro-choice as well. But where a lot of nuance comes in, and I think that's where studying Indian politics is the most fun, is our cultural standing, because there is a plethora of communities, and the Indian project has been called an impossibility since it started. How can one nation possibly accommodate so many identities? Maintaining a link to our cultural past is vital, but if nuance comes into politics, nuance also comes into culture. We cannot fall into the trap of sticking to dogmatic beliefs, because that turns into superiority, that turns into majoritarianism. And one understanding that it's very important to approach politics from is that no one starts at the same footing. We are not on a level playing field. Everyone's beginning at different starting points. So to believe that entering into a free market of ideas, of commodities, we need to question who is it free for? So that being said, I really believe in empowering those who are most disproportionately impacted by the state. So yeah, thank you so much.
I think you put your views perfectly and kind of brought out everything that you wanted us to discuss here today. And I think the fact that you brought out that not all of us are from the same footing gives politics such a different view, which I hadn't thought of before. But now can we have Rahul, please? Can you give us your opinion and where you stand?
Okay, thank you, Tia. Thank you to BIC for having me. And most of all, thank you to all of you for tuning in to watch us. So I believe that in politics, you need to separate it into three separate entities. So there will be economic, there will be social, and there'll be political. Now, economically and politically, I tend to have more right-leaning beliefs. But socially, I tend to have surprisingly radical leftist beliefs for someone who would identify as a right-winger. So my my social and my political and economic stances completely contradict each other. So a lot of people tell me like, you're the only one who has these certain set of beliefs that I've only seen, that I've ever seen. So I think that I think a flaw that a lot of people may like I think a flaw on both sides of the political spectrum is that they tend to stick to one ideology without completely believing in it. So I think, for example, right wingers will stick to right wing ideology to support their respective party, whether they believe in it or not. So I think that that's something that cannot be done in politics, and it leads the public and the general people to manipulation by both sides of the political spectrum. Now, more than my stance on different issues, I like to say that I identify primarily as a libertarian. So I don't believe that, like, I believe in values like small government. I believe that I believe that the people should be able to decide their own fate, and their own beliefs more than anything. And when you talk specifically about the issue of India, and this is going to anger a lot of you watching, I believe something radically different to the other three panelists, because I do not believe in the prospect of a united India. I'll explain that more. I'll explain that more while we go through the chat. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Rahul. I think you brought up topics that will be very interesting for debate. But let's start with Samak. I have a question for you. Since India by constitution is a secular nation, and that by the constitution, people are guaranteed personal rights and personal freedom. So where do you stand on the fact that Hindutva has become such a large part of politics, and legislations that restrict like beef or interreligious marriages? What would you say about this becoming such a prevalent part of India now?
All right, to address the elephant in the room, it's a pretty broad subject and it's a burning issue as well. So in order to say that, okay, we have to accept the fact that we are a secular democracy, and it is accepted by all people of different ideologies as well. But the point being is that when you say that you're a secular democracy, historically, there are many governments in the past as well, and even in the present government, who believe that you need to have certain policies which benefit only certain number of groups. Now, in essence, what a secular democracy actually means is that either you don't exhibit your religion, like what one of the panelists said at France, or two, you treat all religions equally. Now, India has followed the latter, where we treat all religions equally, and it's basically the motto of the present government, which is Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. Now, the point being is that when you have certain policies, say, for example, certain minority groups have getting funding for going to Hajj, or, for example, get scholarships for running their schools, for example, the Christian schools or even madrasa schools, and they're exempt from taxes as well. So now these kind of policies do not benefit a secular democracy. I agree that you want to foster minority rights and etc. But at the same time, there'll be a huge, say, burden on the taxpayers to justify as to why they're paying for something which benefits only a few, and why this discrimination is present in the first place. And in order to move forward as to say why there are legislations in terms of banning beef or interreligious marriages and etc., we need to consider the logic behind it. I agree that in a chaotic political environment where India is at today, you need to understand that there'll always be misuse. We have to understand or take it as a fact that there'll always be misuse of the laws which have been given through the loopholes. And also we need to understand the fact that every law which is enacted in such nature is also a political vote bank. A government does it, government constitutes individuals who represent political parties, and they cater to particular groups of people. So we need to take it as a given that it is biased in nature and the policies are biased in nature, but we need to understand the rationale behind it. Now, if you take the example of beef, first of all, it is secured by the constitution, where they say that slaughter of cows is prevented. It's a directive principle of state policy. It's not enforceable in any court of law. You can't go to a court of law and say that, look, they're slaughtering cows and therefore I want you to do that. That's not possible in any court of law. But the directive principles recommend government to take actions regarding the same. Apart from that, what I believe is, as a consequence of these, I do believe that violence should not occur in society. Now, because there are laws which say say consumption of beef, or which restrict slaughtering of cows and etc., that should not lead to chaotic environment between two religions as to who has an upper hand and who has the political power, or who shows muscular power. I think that is not which is allowed in the first place. And apart from that, we need to understand that secular democracy means treating each and every individual equal. And to say that, suppose let's take example of a taxation policy or something which is an infrastructure policy. Suppose you construct a bridge. In a secular democracy, the bridge should be access to every religion or every person. And as long as that benefit is given to each and every individual or each and every citizen of India, I am fine with that. But the moment it benefits only particular group of people, whether the majority Hindus or the minority Muslims, I don't think we are in a secular democracy anymore. So those are my views.
Thank you for sharing. Would anyone? Yeah, go ahead, Rishika.
Yeah. So I disagree with Sumuk's description of a secular democracy, because secularism doesn't necessarily have to entail equality for all religions. Secularism entails that the state maintains a principled distance from all religious identities, meaning that in a democracy, you cannot, your ultimate goal has to be equality, but equality doesn't come as a given. Like I said earlier, it needs to be based on equitable distribution of welfare and resources. That means when we talk about sabka saath, sabka vikas, we cannot give everyone the same amount of vikas, because not everyone starts at the same level. Why do we have minority privileges, say reservations for religious minorities in educational institutions, or funding for trips to the Hajj, or Christian schools, for example? That's because they're minorities. The Hindu community in India, and this is coming from someone whose family is a Hindu family. The Hindu community in India is not only the majority, it is empowered every single day by the state. And that's a big part of that is because you can argue on the foundation of our nation. At the end of the day, Hindus are a privileged class. This entails their identity in economics, their identity in culture, their identity in every public sphere they enter. We need to be cautious of something that's talked about a lot in leftist circles, which is bridging the gap between theory and praxis. You can argue for the logic behind certain laws because you can say that they tend to benefit everyone. But when that translates into practice, what do you see? You see that those laws are used as excuses or justifications for enacting violence against minority groups. And this is something Sumuk rightly recognizes, is that we cannot pretend that we have to treat every religion equally, because not every religion is equal in the first place. The notion of Hindutva that's sort of besmirching the nation is that it empowers groups that are already empowered. This is the nature of pretending everything is equal. Power concentrates into one entity, and that entity right now is the Hindu state. The reason Muslims are on the streets protesting, the reason classes within Hinduism, the reason Dalits are killed every single day, is because the state empowers an ideology that is founded on suppressing them. So I'd actually like to hear Rahul's opinions on personal liberty when it comes to choosing our religion and choosing where the state stands in terms of our religious identities and what it does. But I think the state's job is to make sure that every religion at least gets to the same footing, and then we can talk about equality. So
Yeah, thank you for that. Rahul, do you have anything to say?
Yeah. Okay. So simple enough response. Fundamentally, I believe that the state should not get into the institution of religion at all. So, like, regardless of which religion you're talking about, whether it's Christianity, whether it's Hinduism, whether it's Islam, you see this in many states, that the state is built around the religious principles of wherever it's located. I believe that that can only be a bad thing for the state, because A, it doesn't promote secularism, and B, it leads to a lot of xenophobia and racism which you would otherwise not have. So in my personal opinion, I disagree with the entire concept of Hindutva. Similarly, I disagree with the concept of Christian supremacism and Muslim supremacism. So for me, regardless of which religion you're talking about, I believe that fundamentally the government should not get into the business of religion at all and allow people to freely practice whatever religion they want to, and not get into the business of any writing up any religious legislation.
Yeah, go ahead.
So in order to quickly counter, I do believe that first of all, we need to separate what theory is and what reality is. So in theory, let's all agree that all religions are equal and all religions should be treated equal. But in reality, you need to understand the composition of this country. We have a composition of say 80+% of Hindus, and the rest fall, the rest of the religions form the remaining 20%. Now we might argue by saying that, oh look, because of the situation, because of this conundrum, it's better to treat everyone equally. But the current government was formed on the belief that, look, I can form a government with the 80% on my side. So they frame policies or structure their policies based on the demands of the 80%. Now, this is sheer political acumen. Now, you can say this is theory or how governance should work, but their version, also their belief is also something different. And that is something which needs to be considered when electing a government in the first place. I do not agree that that's the rightful way to go forward, but I believe that that's the reality. They've used that opportunism, they've used that opportunity where they believe that 80% is with me. So why should I care or take everyone in an equal manner? Why can't I structure policies which benefit the 80% to a larger or considerable extent? So that is sheer political acumen. And a quick counter to say Rishika is that, look, when you have this is a fact, anyone can look it up. After the government of India, the largest landholder in India is the Sunni Waqf Board, followed by the Christian boards. Now you need to understand why is this, because they don't tax the land. All right, so that is something which needs to be addressed. So with such small things create enmity or friction between these societies or communities, because when you give certain benefits, I agree that you have to protect minorities and etc., but you don't, when you say that it's justified to send them to Hajj, why can't a Hindu ask, why can't I go to Kashi or Mathura or even the Ram Mandir? They can also ask for the same thing. They can also ask for the same rights, because they believe they're an equal citizen of India. Because when a common man thinks, he's not going to think that, oh, 80% of the country form Hindus, therefore I'm not getting the benefits. It makes sense. He thinks I am also an equal citizen like the fellow Muslim brother. Why is he getting the benefit of going to his holy place, and why am I not getting this benefit? So such realities should be addressed at the grassroots level, because when we speak on a larger level, or when we speak on the governance part of it, it's easy to say that we have to treat everyone equally. But in reality, a single human being or an individual thinks on such microscopic levels. And if we do not address it, there's always bound to be friction between communities. And I believe that remedying such microscopic issues will lead to a more vibrant democracy of India.
Yeah, go ahead.
Awesome. So I completely agree with what Rishika said, but just to take the conversation forward on what Sumukh has stated, he stated that there is, like, he calls it discrimination, that few minority groups are getting external benefits, getting extra benefits. And I find that so ironic, because those benefits are given because those minority communities have been discriminated against for centuries now, right? It's very simple. When there are two lines, think of these as two lines. If you want equality, you're not going to say push both of them, because that gap is always going to remain. You're not leveling the playing field. First, you level the playing field to here, get everyone to be equal, and then you try to push both up equally, right? But to do that, first, you need to provide those that are disadvantaged, those that are minority groups, up to that playing field, so that they're able to enjoy the same advantages that majority groups and those who come from more privileged backgrounds are able to enjoy. Because today it's the sad reality. I think Rahul stated that he believes that people should be the sole determinants of their destiny, right? They should have equal opportunity, and they should be able to basically achieve the future that they want to. But when there's so much inequality, that is not something that can be achieved, right? And just adding on to that, and this is not from me, I was reading a book and I saw this wonderful analogy there, and I just like to share that. Basically, the book stated that India is like a thali. Okay, we have multiple identities, which are the number of dishes in different bowls. Right now, those bowls don't necessarily flow into each other, but they all belong together on the same platform, and they combine to give you a wonderful and beautiful palette. And I think that is a wonderful analogy for India. We have different identities, and if the last census again didn't get it wrong, I think we have 1.3 billion identities, different identities, right? And we come together in with all our differences to create the Indian nation that we are today. But what we have been seeing since 2014 is a systematic and sustained resort on those basic underpinnings of what being Indian means and what the Indian nation is all about. I don't think since 2014 what Indian nationalism is anchored on is diversity or difference, or it's not anchored in liberal institutions that cooperation is built on, but it's rather now becoming nationalism of identity, and that identity is extremely niche. And honestly, I think it can be summarized by the phrase Hindi, Hindu, and Hindustan, right? And I don't think that is the idea, that is the sole idea of the Constitution. I think that's a very different idea of Indian nationalism, and which is why I think Indian nationalism today, the idea of Indian nationalism is under strain.
Thank you for that. Before we move on with the discussion, there's a very interesting question. If we can look at Mr. Aman's question, it says that grossly inaccurate that religious pilgrimages are sponsored for Muslims alone. And he mentions that Hindus get sponsorship too. Sumukh, do you have anything to say for this?
Yes, I do. So I believe that, see, like, I'll answer both Mr. Aman's and Anjali's contentions as well. So when you believe that there's no level playing field and you need to bridge the gap first and then look for equality, now you need to understand what naturally means to bridge the gap. So you can, if you say education, if you say healthcare, if you say job opportunities, I agree that, okay, the minorities have been always been on the back foot, they've not given equal opportunities, you can go ahead. And I don't think anyone objects for, say, schooling for Muslim girl children where subsidies are given, or if cycles are given, or if books are given. All I'm saying is how are religious pilgrimages an essential part of equality? It's basically something which is related to faith. Now, it necessarily, it's a want, it's not a need. A need is something which is food, what, health, or say electricity, or is something related to job opportunities. Going to a religious place is a want, and that necessarily doesn't categorize under the ambit of bridging the gap. And in order to answer Mr. Aman's question, need to understand what kind of benefits are given. So if you look at the religious pilgrimages, they do not sponsor people to go, because I have been to religious pilgrimages myself. They necessarily don't sponsor you to go and visit these places or Tirth Yatras. What they essentially do is the government, they build like each state government, for example, in Haridwar, or in, say, in the upcoming Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, each state government buys a plot of land and they build a bhavan or a chowdhury type of a building, and they allow their people of their state to stay, and that's the only benefit which is given. And I think such similar benefits are given to all religions across India, or all faiths across India. For example, if you go to the Ranakpur temples in Rajasthan, such facilities are given by all state government. So we need to like sponsoring an entire trip from here to Saudi Arabia and back, and something which is meant for the shelter and the healthcare facilities for a pilgrim, which is essential part of his pilgrimage. I think there are broadly different, like say, levels of assistance which is given by the state. So I think what I believe again is that you should bridge the gap on what is essential or what is a necessity, not something which satisfies person based on his religion or something which helps you gain votes. As simple as that. Whether it is the Hindus or the Muslims, don't like if I was a government servant, I wouldn't do something which benefits a particular only because that helps his religion and gets me votes. As simple as that.
Agreed, Sumuk, but what would you feel about the fact that the Indian government gives temples so much money? How is that benefiting the nation in any way? How is it helping us progress towards bringing people onto a level field? Wouldn't you say that money could probably be used for something better?
Temples in the sense you need to I didn't get a question because I don't think the government sponsors temples, because the temples are also under the government. So for example, in Karnataka you have something called as Mujrai, where all the proceedings from a temple, if you offer something to the hundi, it doesn't go to the temple directly, so that money goes to the government as well. So I think is that the reverse concept you're asking? Because there is a movement to free temples but actually not to sponsor temples.
Yeah, I didn't mean sponsor, but I'm saying that a lot of money is directed towards temples from the government, which could have been used for other,
Could you cite examples?
Like how Rishika brought up the fact that, it's important to bring people up to the same playing field. That money could be used in policies that would help push that ideology.
So I personally believe is that, see, one, there should be a non-interference power between religion and the state, as simple as that. But I do believe that I don't think there's any explicit rule or any provision in any state in India which directly sponsors money to a temple, unless it's a built World Heritage site or an archaeological site, as simple as that. But coming to the point, I think the money which is sponsored, I think it's mostly meant for rejuvenation. So for example, if you take Tirupati, which is one of the holiest centers for Hindus, I think if you look at how money is spent in Tirupati, I don't think you should say that, oh, it's only for Hindus. It's more for generating revenue for the city as well. So what governments have taken upon themselves is to create a smart city or say an urban center for temple institutions or temple towns in India. So Ayodhya in the future, according to the Yogi government, is to not only be limited to Ram Mandir. They want to build a mega city out of it, airports, industries, perhaps an investment as well. So if you look at it that way, where they're trying to create investment model to a temple town, I think I'm fine with it. But I don't see any explicit example of them sponsoring a temple directly.
All right, fair enough. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Rishika.
I'll make this concise so we can move forward. But one thing I really agree with Sumuk on is the understanding of a political realities, because in political discussions, it's easy to get caught up in sort of ideological dogma, right? That being said, this is exactly why we need to reflect on political realities. The first thing that you talked about, how faith is a want rather than an essential need, that's true. But the reality of the situation is that people in India greatly identify with their religious identities. What identity is the state legitimizing? And that is the Hindu identity, more specifically, the Brahmin Hindu identity. If you talk about why certain people who identify as Hindus are not able to pay pilgrimage to their religious foundations because maybe they can't afford it, maybe because there's limits, we need to examine the internal stratification within Hinduism that comes from caste stratification. Second thing is, even if because people cannot exercise a religious identity because they think it's not because a Muslim person is getting benefited, that benefit isn't being taken away from the Hindus and given to the Muslims. It's being allocated to the Muslims because they are the ones, as Anjali said, have historically been disenfranchised. The one last thing I want to say is the building of Ayodhya as a smart city. Once again, the question of state legitimacy comes into point. The Adityanath government is legitimizing Ayodhya, a Hindu foundation. So when it builds a smart city that's founded on investment, it is going to become a vicious cycle where it only benefits people who identify as Hindu. We can say, let's welcome Muslims, let's welcome Christians. But it's also important to remember the RSS is also open to Muslims and Christians. Who are they actually benefiting though? What identity are they legitimizing? Who actually derives welfare from this? It certainly is not the Muslims in India.
Thank you. I think you brought up very valid points, which are interesting in debate. But now I want to ask Anjali a question, which is more related to like freedom of speech and that background. Where do you stand on the fact that internet intermediaries like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram are picking sides in this debate? That they say, I will not remove certain tweets about farmer protests, so that I will ban like handles or posts of Trump. When we look at freedom of speech, shouldn't the plurality of ideas, spreading the good and the bad, be the basis? So where would you stand on that?
I think that's such an interesting question, especially with respect to today's times when the POTUS was banned off all social media, right? I think social media companies have avoided accountability by just stating that we promote free speech. So, and they've marketed and branded themselves as we are the free speech party, and we're the free speech wing of the free speech party, right? And that's something Twitter has for the past decade really invested in, that branding, right? And I find it, I feel like I have mixed opinions on this. On one hand, I feel great that Trump was banned off social media, but at the same time, I think that's a very slippery slope. And I'm scared that this sets a dangerous precedent, okay? Because at this point, they cited that Trump was inciting violence, right? Which is why they banned him off social media. But who is Jack Dorsey, somebody who's never been actively involved in public life, to decide whether the POTUS gets to remain on social media or not? Because tomorrow there could be somebody, like currently with regard to the farmers' protests, a lot of people are saying that, the violence that they've incited should not be encouraged. Twitter has blocked a lot of accounts saying that they've incited violence, right? So who decides what is inciting of that violence? Because I don't think that farmers accounts that are promoting the pledge of farmers should be blocked, right? So I think that arbitrary nature of social media companies is scary. And honestly, I don't know, because at the same time, you need freedom of speech has its extent, right? I do believe in freedom of speech, but I do also believe that with that comes its rights and responsibilities. And the moment that your freedom of speech invalidates lived experiences, especially that of minorities, you're misusing that freedom of speech, and freedom of speech should have that extent, right? But at the same time, I think it's a very slippery slope to decide what is what is just opposing views and what is truly offensive and invalidating lived experiences and inciting violence. Yeah.
Well, I think that begins to pose the question of who gets to decide that, and whose views are now viewed as correct and whose views are now viewed as politically wrong. Does anyone have anything else to say about this? Okay, Rahul.
Okay, so what I feel that the social media firms are currently doing is they are pandering to the demands of like a hypersensitive minority who will get offended at the drop of a hat. They'll get offended if anyone says anything that they don't agree with. And I think that's a very dangerous path to go down, because it sets the precedent that being offended at everything and not listening to something you don't agree with is okay. So I feel that I personally feel that social media companies, since they are an external body, they don't represent, they obviously have their own incentives for censoring things, because people within that company will have their own political views, etc. So I do not believe that they should have the power to moderate what people hear and what people don't hear.
Valid. Yeah, Rishika.
I just like to say that social media companies are pandering to the corporations that give them profit, and the corporations that give them profit are surprisingly dependent on the political zeitgeist. Trump was removed once he was going out of office, not during his 4 terms as prime minister, because Jack Dorsey knew that the moment he removes Trump, corporate beneficiaries who lobby Trump are going to be at his necks. This hypersensitive minority might be extremely vocal, but once again, there's nuance to everything. We can't generalize a certain minority, and we can all argue who is hypersensitive and who isn't. That being said, I agree with Anjali when she says that this sets a dangerous precedent, because who gets to decide what is right and wrong? Often that comes into, if not social media corporations, then is it the public? Is it the state? And I think that's a question that I'm glad has been opened up for discussion today. And I hope many people get to voice their opinions on it. What I'd like to say is that social medias are supposed to be, it's a public platform. It can be a force for good, it can be a force for bad. So when we talk about free speech, it's important to examine, once again, free for whom, and is one person's freedom unbridled freedom suppressing anyone else's unbridled freedom? It's also important to know that Twitter recently introduced a new policy, which means that they have a committee of people who will decide whose accounts get to say and whose accounts get to go. So once again, there's a lot of nuance that needs to be added to that debate. But I think there is some scope for benefit here, but it's so slippery, because once again, who are we platforming? Who are we deplatforming? Who gets to decide what's right and wrong? Who is inciting violence and who is simply voicing their opinions or frustrations with the state? So yeah.
Yeah, I think the line between right and wrong in this situation is so fine, and trying to find that balance is, in my opinion, practically impossible in today's world. But yeah, Sumuk, please tell us what you think.
Yeah, so I'll keep this concise. So obviously, I wouldn't get into legality of whether a private organization can ban a state-run account or something. But I do believe that this has larger consequences. And according to me, it's about narratives. So in today's world, the world over, everything is about creating a narrative, whether it is BJP's model of Hindutva or if it's Trump's policies of, say, border immigration centers or something. Everyone has a narrative. Now, when you say that private, if we assume for a moment that private organizations have an unfettered power to, say, deplatform anyone, we need to answer the larger question: what if tomorrow there's a person who colludes with these private organizations and dismantles each and every dissent account? So, for example, if we have a government in power in India, suppose, and they work closely with Twitter India, and they make sure that each and every opposition voice on Twitter, because social media now is the de facto platform to voice your opinion. It's not that I have to go to a stage in a park and give a speech and only then people will hear my voice. It's platforms like this, say suppose Zoom or say social media, where you can give your opinion and it can be accessed by millions of people world over. So if Twitter India, say suppose tomorrow, starts banning each and every opposition account, only one narrative will sell. Only one narrative from one political entity or one political party will sell. So those are larger consequences for destroying a democracy. And I think it's worser and crux of what the modern world is. If you're not able to address this at this instance, I think it will be very bad for the future, because it will go to an extent where we can't control it.
So I think maybe one thing that we all are agreeing with is that this slope is so slippery and can either result in something that might be very good or something that's just disastrous. But if no one has anything else to say, we can move on. But also, oh yeah, okay, one sec before we get to Rahul. Audience, please ask us questions. We've kept a designated time, so feel free to ask anything about anything that we're talking about. Yeah, go ahead, Rahul.
Personally, I feel like there's no solution to this issue that'll make everyone happy, because the thing is, right now the companies are justifying banning some accounts as that people are inciting violence or they're taking part in hate speech. But the problem is that hate speech is such an ambiguous term, and like everyone has a different opinion on whether what someone said is hate speech. So for example, people on the left will think that whatever Trump tweets is hate speech. People on the right will support him no matter what. So what I think is like the only possible solution for these social media companies, in order to not anger some group of people, is to not take any responsibility for anything that's going on. And the only feasible way in which they can do that is to just not regulate what's being put out on their forum at all.
I could see Anjali getting very distressed through that. Do you have anything to say?
I do. So it's very easy for us to say that, hey, it's not social media's fault, it's people's fault. But you need to recognize that it is social media that facilitates that problematic culture or system. For example, why there's such one of the reasons why there's such increasingly radical polarization that we see globally today, I think one of the root causes is social media. So how social media algorithms work is they show you content that you consume based on your past experiences. So for example, if I follow a lot of, let's say, left pages, feminist pages, right, that's the content I'm going to be bombarded with on my Instagram, on Facebook. I actually was writing this research paper on this, and we did this little experiment where I searched the word Indian politics on Google, and I got reports from like left-leaning news media houses, right? But I made one of my friends do that, and they got different search results that came from right-leaning news media houses, right? And I feel like what this does, I think this is really harmful and can erupt into something extremely dangerous, because we're getting overconfident in the validity of our opinions, right? When I'm constantly being reaffirmed that, hey, XYZ is true, I'm getting extremely overconfident in that stance, right? And I'm not being able to see through that. I'm getting stuck in this echo chamber, this epistemic bubble, that I don't even know what exists outside of it. It's not that I'm not looking outside, it's that I'm actively being repressed from seeing what's outside, which is why I think that's also one thing that's extremely could be extremely problematic. At the same time, I'm not like, I don't know the solution to this. And again, it comes down to the whole debate on, like, should social media companies be responsible for the behavior of the population? I don't have a clear answer to that, but I know that this is one area of problem that I can actively identify.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that summed up this kind of question quite well. But let's move on to Rishika. Don't you think that the inherent right of democracy is that the majority government should be criticized? That kind of brings a check to the majority government. And do you think India's political state, where India stands right now, provides people with the freedom to do that?
That's a great question. One of sort of my principal political beliefs is that citizenship needs to be cognitive, it needs to be critical, and it needs to it needs to identify the gap between itself and its representatives. Because one thing that India has been lauded on for so long is being the world's largest democracy, right? It means that every individual citizen gets to express their beliefs and legitimize their expressions in electoral representation. And electoral representation matters at every single level, but more so at the grassroots. Honest question, how many of us know who's the councillor of our sort of citizen ward, the person who's elected to the municipal corporation? We all know our prime minister, some of us even know our president, but who is the panchayat of the villages we live near? The funny thing is, those are things that affect us more immediately than our national government. I said earlier that it's easier to get lost in ideological battles when it comes to politics rather than what the reality of the situation is. And I think the reality of the situation entails recognizing nuance, recognizing that your government can do right, it can do wrong, it can do things that might be right for someone else and wrong for you, it can do things that are right for no one, and maybe one or two people. So I think that, and it's understandable why so many people say, oh, why are you always criticizing the government? They're trying their best. They have to please their vote bank. They can't please everyone. It's important to realize that the nature of Indian democracy is plurality. The Indian democratic project was never built on the idea that any one ideology should assume absolute power, should assume an absolute majority in the Lok Sabha. More so that when the Congress did have a majority in the Lok Sabha, they were either in a coalition, in an alliance, or their own party held up beliefs of ideological plurality. Congress, emerging from Indian freedom when it had the most power, entailed people from many social backgrounds, social classes. And we could definitely argue that that sort of internal stratification creates a very like a dispute of beliefs, which delays democracy. And we can argue about if democracy delayed means democracy denied, just as it goes with justice. But I think it's important to consider that the fabric of India is multicultural. It has multiple classes, multiple religious identities. So the moment we say that one man or one party can represent all of that, we need to step back into our shoes and recognize where we're saying this from. Maybe as a Hindu man, it's easy to say that yes, your beliefs are represented. As a Muslim woman, as a Dalit woman, as a trans woman in India, you cannot say that. And once again, your identity isn't unitary. Your identity entails various social aspects. It's important to be critical of the government, because the moment we stop being critical of the government becomes critical of us. It's important to harbor resentment against the government when it does wrong, because the government will harbor resentment against us. Why are we seeing activists jailed for voicing their opinions? And this goes both to the right and the left. Your job as a citizen doesn't stop once you hit a button on the electoral voting machine. In fact, it starts there. It starts when you scrutinize everything your government is doing. It starts when you scrutinize who it's benefiting. The reason journalism is in the crisis that we see it is in today, the reason people are afraid to voice their opinions on social media, the reason privileged people are avoid to go to protests, is because an active, targeted project has been launched against free speech, because the government knows that it cannot stand on its own feet any longer. This is more evident with the farmers' protest, because the farmers are a critical voting bank of the government, right? They are their developmental foundation. Because the government accumulated power, it knew that it could get away with this. I really suggest our audience and our panelists to check out this book called The Shock Doctrine, which talks about how a government in power who has unbridled power can easily pass legislation that would otherwise be hotly contested in the midst of crisis or in the midst of any other forms of other political issues. If you're not critical of the government, we are giving them too much leeway. I will be as critical of a leftist government as I would be of our current government. And because that is your job as a citizen. So.
Yeah, go ahead, Anjali.
Great. I absolutely agree with Rishika on almost everything that she said, especially the first part of it. It's, often jokingly said about India that whatever you say about India, the opposite can also be true. But I think it's safe to say that the singular thing that can be said about India is that everything exists plurally, right? And even when we look at it historically, from our independence and the formation of the constitution, at a time when most developing countries, they opted for authoritative form of government to promote nation building, India chose to be a multi-party democracy and continued to be so. Which is why I think it's very important for us to understand at this point that the government is not India, its people are. Today, the talk is titled Young, Free and Political. I'm young, I'm political, I'm not sure about the free part, right? Because every time I criticize the government, not every time, very often when I criticize the government, right? I am labeled Deshdrohi, I am labeled anti-national, right? Which is why the distinction between the distinction that the government is not India becomes so vital and pertinent, right? Because I'm not even going to go so as far as to talk about the freedoms I feel are denied to me, such as just walking safely on streets, etc., right? But the freedom of speech. And I don't say this just based on a gut feeling, right? When comedians are jailed for cracking a joke they didn't crack, right? When artists are detained for posting cartoons that criticizes the government, when somebody holding a poster which says Azadi in a Amit Shah rally is harassed and evicted, when when people are fired from their jobs because of something they posted on Twitter that was against the government and as per their beliefs anti-national, when there are proposals that passports should not be cleared if you post something quote unquote anti-Indian, why will I feel safe to have conversations like I do right now? One of the reasons is definitely privilege, right? I feel like I am privileged enough to have these conversations, but somebody that comes from, let's say, a quote unquote lower caste background, somebody that comes from a religious minority, might not feel as safe as I do having these conversations online and offline, right? And I feel like we have always been a secular liberalism, but we're slowly heading towards a sectarianism. And I don't think that's the right path that we're walking or should be walking towards.
Yeah, I think you brought up a very pertinent question, which is about the fact that we're allowed to have these debates and we're allowed to be on this platform because of privilege, which is something that controls what you can and can't do, especially in India. Yeah, Sumuk, please tell us. I'm interested to see what you have to say about this.
Yeah. All right. So first of all, I do believe that you need to talk about the labels. All right. So when she brought out the point that I'll be labeled a Desdrohi. Now, first of all, this is an echo chamber which happens on both sides. The fact that there might be something which is contextual, which is anti-Indian, but not necessarily every dissent is anti-Indian. That's a fundamental question which we need to understand. Now, the point what I'm trying to make over here is that certain words have been overused so much and that trivializes and questions whether a person can speak. Now, this also works in terms of the opposition over here, where every action is seen to be fascist, like anything what the government does is considered to be fascist. And people on the government side, what they do is anytime someone criticizes the government, they label them anti-Indian or Desdrohi or traitor or Naxal or whatever. So first of all, the labeling or the misnomering process should stop, first of all. And to talk about how, say, free speech works, first of all, like it's a universal concept. It's not something which is related to ideology. It's not something that, oh, only people on the left wing believe in free speech and people on the right wing don't. It's a universal concept we need to understand. But sadly, to talk about India, it's a display of having a field day. The thing is that whichever government has in power, there'll always be cronies or lackeys who say that, no, there's absolute free speech over here. You're the one who's delusioned that there's no free speech. It works that way. If there's a left-wing government in power, they believe that the free speech in this country is absolutely fine. If there's a right-wing government in power, they believe that free speech is absolutely fine. Because if you look at 1970s, the Congress kept on defending the fact that Indira Gandhi's government is for free speech, even though the country was under emergency. All right. So you need to understand that India's politics is built in such a manner where display of power is seen as a common tendency to assert dominance. So in other countries, it's more of our discourse, like what we are having right now, where we're reflecting our thoughts, where we're reflecting our opinions. That necessarily doesn't happen for a larger extent in India. And I think that's welcome as a right winger or a conservative and as a citizen of India. I think that is what we should focus on, because this question which you brought out is not ideological in nature. It's something which can be reformative in nature. So for example, in the Middle Ages, to bring out an analogy, the Pope shifted his place from the Vatican to Avignon in France. People were like, why? Because he's like, I want to see what a Protestant thinks. So similarly, I think what the government should do over here is that it should come out from his mantle. Now, we can always say that ideals like of the people, by the people, for the people, these are just ideals, but I think it should be acted upon. The government should actually come and sit and discuss with people. Or, all right, if you believe that the Prime Minister cannot come because he's too busy, I think what the citizens should do is they should use the resources which are available to them. Use the Right to Information Act. Use institutions or departments which are meant for them, say the National Commission for Backward Castes, National Commission for Scheduled Tribes, National Commission for Scheduled Castes. These are not just institutions created so that, oh, we have something to show that we have done something. These are actually institutions which can be important as a fulcrum for democracy, and sadly underused in India. People hardly know who are the executives in these departments, how do you approach these departments, what can you do with these departments. Nobody has a clue. I think that is what we need to focus upon. And I think grotesque characterization that a government in power is fascist or any person who criticizes is an anti-national, I think that really doesn't help us. It just helps us make a point or a opinion that, oh no, I'm not free, but that doesn't solve anything. I think what needs to be done is using these resources or institutions in order to move the country forward, because this is not an ideological question. It is a question about India's essence. And as I said again, this changes only when politics in this country changes. And I again repeat that politics in this country is built upon power. It is not built upon discourse. The person in power will always try to make, whether it's left winger or right winger or an MLA or an MP, he'll always try to shove your voice down. So that's something which needs to be changed. It's not something which is pertaining to an ideology.
Yes, Rishika.
I think Rahul can go first because they had.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so replying to what Sumukh said, I believe that yeah, I agree that the problem with politics, especially in India, is that people are not really caring what the policy that they make, like what implications it'll have to the general population. They're just looking at the majority, which in our case is Hindu, and they're saying we need to appease these Hindus because that is what will keep us in power. So I think that that's generally not a good thing. And then this brings me on to my wider narrative that I think that if India is to stay united, then a democracy is not, I mean, a democracy, you need to deal with that dangerous precedent that the politicians can get away with pandering to only a majority of the population and completely ignore a minority of the population. So that is basically the problem that India faces with having a democracy. And I mean, I believe that can only be alleviated by not having a united India in the first place.
Sumukh. Rishika, and then we'll hear what Sumukh has to say.
Yeah, I know we're sort of edging into our time window, so I'll just wrap this up quickly. One ethos that I sort of define my politics by is that the power of the people is stronger than the people in power. I couldn't agree more with Sumukh when he says that politics is founded on power. Politics is about power relations, and power in itself is such a nuanced concept that have like a million theorists have theorized it. So many people from so many identities have talked about it. But what it comes down to is if you have to tell people that you are powerful, you are not powerful. It's as simple as that, which means that a government that is truly serving its people, that is truly trying its best to alleviate the living conditions of all identities that comprise its state, is a government that is not afraid to be criticized. I agree. RTIs are such a powerful instrument. Voicing dissent is such a powerful instrument. But why do you think RTI activists are jailed or threatened? Why do we think people who dissent and go out to protest in the streets are jailed or threatened? That's because this government knows that it cannot expose itself to criticism. It's standing on very shaky foundations. The reason people aren't using grievance redressal systems or RTI systems or other institutions that the government has given them is because there's a lot of bureaucracy, and bureaucracy is established by those in power because we know it alienates a person from their government. And the second is because that system of grievance redressal is slowly eroding. We need to be very cognizant of how the state is collecting power around itself and within itself. The idea of a united India, I feel like Rahul is echoing everything everyone said before India became independent. It's an impossible project. There's no way it should survive. It should descend into either majoritarian ethnic cleansing or a breakup into successionist states. We're here 74 years later having this discussion. It's important to recognize that we're having this discussion because a lot of us come from homogenous groups. But the more you go out into the world, on your college campuses, on other processions, you see people from a plethora of so many identities. Everyone wants to define their lives. Everyone wants a sense of freedom. Everyone sees an ideal of a nation. That ideal is one that can accommodate everyone. Is it an impossible project? Maybe. Am I still willing to take it up? You can sure as hell say that. So.
Thank you for that. If we can move on to the next question I have for Rahul. Rahul, do you think that the political discourse and conversation in India is so polarized, like it's polarized itself by branding people that are liberal as left wing and that are conservative as right wing?
See, I think that by branding liberals as left wing and by branding conservatives as right wing, you completely ignore the fact that there are people who believe in a specific political and economic ideology who don't necessarily believe in the same social ideology. So I feel like you're pushing people on both sides of the spectrum to give up some of their beliefs to conform to one of the ideologies. So for example, I have been pushed by a lot of right wingers to conform to conservative social constructs because they say that like you're not a true right winger if you don't conform to this. So I think that this whole categorizing of people into certain political ideologies and generalization is like very dangerous, and I feel that politically everyone needs to be an independent in their own way, so they need to have their own stance on issues which are not influenced by the categorization of anyone else.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that answered the question quite well. Does anyone have anything else to say, or should we move on to the question and answer part? All right. So we can start with the question that's directed to Anjali. It says that when you cited examples of being labeled as Deshori or anti-national, etc., when criticizing the government's actions, and you clearly brought up that India isn't government itself. Do you think that this runs that other way around too? Like while criticizing the government, people end up resorting to criticizing the nation and taking steps against it, like blemishing its image, tarnishing its symbols, for example, flags. Like many times the hatred for the government has converted to the nation. Do you feel like the difference between the nation and its government must be understood on both sides?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So I feel like I can draw another analogy here. It's like when you're in a toxic, abusive household, right? And every time you try to voice your concern, people will shut you down by, like, the people within your household will try to shut you down by, hey, don't air your dirty laundry outside, right? And this is one analogy largely being used right now, especially after um, international figures such as Rihanna, Greta, Mina Harris, all um, posted on Twitter and other social media platforms and voiced their concerns about the human rights violations concerning the farmers' protests, right? And post that, a lot of famous figures, especially cricketers of India, they brought up phrases such as you're violating the international sovereignty of India, this is a Indian matter, we'll take care of it, right? But I don't think it works that way, right? Because India was the one that spoke about violations in Sri Lanka in the 1990s. They were the ones who have constantly spoken about human rights violations in Pakistan, in China, and so on and so forth, right? So it doesn't. I mean, you get what you give, right? So you can't be a hypocrite in this matter. As for ruining the image of India, I feel like, and this is completely my opinion, I feel like the current government in power has been, like, the people don't need to do that, the government has been doing a great job at it itself, right? Did you know in the past 4 years, two of the covers of the Economist magazines have been against Modi, right? They've made cartoons that have been against Modi. um, for example, this is just one of the examples, right? When you burn pictures of Greta and Rihanna and Mina Harris, that has happened, I think, less than 2 days back, right? After, in response to their raising concerns about farmers' protests. That is what ruins the image of India, not protests, not voicing concerns, not dissenting against the oppressive government in power.
Yeah, go ahead, Rishika.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one of my favorite Tagore quotes is that the nation is not its flag or the land it is built on; it is its people. And it's true. Hate is bipartisan. Resentment is bipartisan. But we need to identify, as Samuk said, the narratives that are employed by those in power and by those who are not empowered. When we think of Ambedkar was extremely critical of Hinduism to the point where he saw that any oppression exercised against him as a Dalit man came from Hinduism, which is why he converted into Christianity. Masses of people converted into Christianity. That is because Hindu scriptures can say, oh, actually, it's the Varna system. It's based on your inherent worth as a person, not on your birth. But how has that narrative been translated? Who is it going to be translated by? The Brahmins. What is their goal? To reserve their power. How do they reserve their power? By suppressing those below them. The Brahmins have made it a system of birth. After a certain point, it is irrelevant what the Hindu scriptures say, because what is actually being enacted on the disenfranchised is how Hinduism is being used against them to suppress them, to deprive them of their rights. This is not a criticism of Hinduism. This is a criticism of the Hindu narrative that suppresses Dalit communities and other backward classes and castes. That being said, I don't protest because I hate India. I protest because I love India. That is so important to understand. I am not saying that I am critical of the government because India is wrong. The government is attaching its idea to the saffron, to the national flag, saying that India's foundation is a Hindu nation. Why are people critical of the RSS? When we think of what the founder of the RSS said, that, Father India, it's this masculine identity that is built on the ethnic cleansing of minorities that needs to provide itself power by concentrating it into one religious identity. That's not India. It never was, it never will be. The point is, who is attaching themselves to the nation here? Who is building a narrative out of the national flag? And that's when we consider who actually is accusing someone of hating India and who is accusing someone of, simply dissenting against a certain unequal ideal.
Samuk, do you have anything to respond to that?
So I do believe that this question ultimately boils down to what nationalism is. So I don't think cover in a foreign magazine has anything to do with what the government does, because I can always hire a foreign editor to say, oh, dude, just stick a picture of Rahul Gandhi as a joker and that's done. Modi is the best prime minister. So that's really not an indicator of how a country performs internationally. Do I believe that? See, I think nobody ever criticized Rihanna's involvement in farmers' protests. What they criticized was it as a valid argument used by the left to say that, no, oh, look, the government of India, down, and etc. See, there's a difference between a foreign celebrity exercising her opinion, and there's a difference between people using that opinion as an argument. So I think that is the common differentiation you need to make. And two, we need to accept the fact that, look, if you believe that, oh, the cricketers who come forward in creating a common tweet scenario saying India against propaganda is wrong, it's also equal to say on part of the right wingers that this is also pre-planned, because this is not something which any right winger is claiming because the question was brought over here. It's a thing which has been leaked by Greta herself. She leaked the toolkit which showed the schedule of what can be tweeted, whom to tag, and etc. So these are things which happen on a daily basis across the left and right wing by they use influencers in order to create a narrative. We need to understand that we live in a society today that's based on narratives. But when we go on the larger aspect of what nationalism is, I completely believe that it's India first. All right. So to talk about what do I mean by India first, it means, one, respecting who you are as an Indian first, and then coming to your political ideology. So when you talk about, say, do not want a united India, or when you say that Assam is not part of India, when you say that Kashmir is not part of India, that is something which is tarnishing the national image of India. Now, you might say that that's a fair opinion, but no, because it's a sensitive topic and it is something which has a lot of political as well as legal machinations to it. So you can't always categorize sensitive pieces of information to saying that, oh, it's well within my reach. And these are national ideals. So for example, when you say that I wouldn't stand for the national anthem, or when you say that I do not respect the constitution, or when you say that I don't respect the national flag, these are some things which are inherently part of an Indian citizen. So when you're not able to respect that, I don't think you don't have any other qualms or questions in order to go forward. So suppose if someone tomorrow comes and says that, oh, look, I'll replace the national flag with the religious flag, that is something which should be opposed equally by all Indian citizens. All right, that has not been done before, and I don't think that will be done in the future as well. But when you take the example of the recent protest by the farmers on 26 Jan, what was ideally a flagpole meant for the national flag, they hoisted their holy Sikh flag, which is the Nishan Sahib. Now, it was condemned only by one particular segment of the population because that helps their narrative. It wasn't questioned or criticized by the left because they knew that it was something which will go against their own plans of because they support the protest over here, because they're anti-government over here. So again, as I said, it's about narrative. So because when you come to such a scenario where we are supporting two sides, I think it's come to the common consensus of what an Indian is. And if you my personal belief is, if you're not able to respect your national flag or anthem or the constitution, I don't think you have any right to call yourself an Indian. As simple as that.
I think we'll hear Rahul. We haven't heard him in a while, and then we'll circle back.
So actually, I disagree with the point that Sumak brought up. My understanding is more similar to Rishika's, which is that like, if you want to fundamentally identify as an Indian, then you need to speak up for what's wrong. And at the end of the day, doing something like disrespecting the Constitution, what essentially is the Constitution? The Constitution is basically a bunch of legislation that was written by the founders of India. Now, you can criticize the Constitution without disrespecting the moral ideology behind the building of India. So you need to separate the actual function of the Constitution from its historical and nationalistic importance. So when someone criticizes the Constitution, they're not saying that like, I hate India, I hate Indians, stuff like that. They're essentially saying that this is something that is wrong with the foundations of India, and this is something that I would like to change. So I think it's important to draw the line between disrespecting the legislature and disrespecting the policies and disrespecting the national sentiment in general.
Let's hear Anjali and then Rishika.
Yeah, okay, so Tia just texted me and told me to keep it short, so I'll keep it short. But okay, I think the logic that don't talk about it because it's complex, it's nuanced, there's a lot of history and legislature that goes into it. That logic is flawed because I think this is one of the tools that people use when they want you to remain disempowered. Instead of saying this, if you do empower those people with the appropriate and relevant knowledge that you need, I feel like that will bear more fruitful results. Second, there's a difference between nationalism, nationalist sentiment, show of nationalism, and extremist nationalism. When I go to a movie hall, do we really need to have the national anthem before it? I mean, I'm not saying I don't stand up for it or I don't sing along. I do. But I'm just like, the only point I want to bring forward is, where all do we need that show of nationalism, and to what extent do we need it? Like, definitely we need it, but is it necessary for it to be ubiquitous? And the third, and I think the most important point I want to bring forward right now, is that I think you should do a fact check, because the farmers protest, they did not bring down an Indian flag to put up their Sikh flag. They put it up next. So if you go look at it, and this is why there was so much outrage on the internet. In the beginning, the narratives were pushed towards, hey, they put down the Indian flag and put up their own flag. That's not what was done. The Indian flag was flying high right above, and below that, they put up one of their own flags as well. But the way the narratives were twisted and changed and the way media propagated it was wrong. And I think it's very typical of a certain community to dissent police, because instead of, because they rather tell the oppressed how to protest instead of telling the oppressors to stop oppressing. And I think that is extremely wrong.
We'll hear Rishika, then Samuk, because he looks very. Rishika, do you mind if he goes first? He
Yeah,
looks
he wants to
stressed.
No, it's just one point. So I never said that they brought down the Indian flag. What I meant was the flagpole, which is always there. That is where the prime minister hoists the flag. Because if you notice in the Red Fort, there are two flagpoles. One, the larger one, where the flag is always hoisting, which you pointed out. The second one, where the national flag is hoisted by the prime minister only on important holidays like 26th January or Independence Day. So that flagpole was vacant, and that is where the Sikh flag was hoisted. I never said it was brought down. But yeah, for your opinion, like you're free to have your opinions. Yeah, Rishika, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Samak. I just have two things to say. The first is that this political theorist once said that the state constantly needs to be rediscovered. The idea of India is malleable, it is dynamic, it is not stuck in history, it evolves with the times. The idea of India can be empowering, the idea of India can also be weaponized, because this idea is formed by the person who is disseminating it. There is a difference when I stand up for the national anthem on Independence Day, and there is a difference when I'm asked to stand up for the national anthem by a certain government with certain ideas. It's important to examine those nuances. The second thing I just want to say is our sort of obligation as an Indian to institutions of India is once again, this is the conflict. Do we ask what the nation can do for us, or do we ask what we can do for the nation? I strongly support the former. That's all.
Thank you for that. Let's move on to the next question, which is directed at Rahul. It says that, don't you think that the slippery slope goes both ways? It's pretty evident that a complete void of regulation leads to not just a toxic, but plainly illegal activity. Doesn't providing a platform also entail a responsibility to ensure that the platform isn't used in ways that are plainly illegal? And if not, who should be the jury?
Okay, so I think what the companies like Twitter and Instagram and YouTube and Facebook have done is like they've essentially provided a platform, like they've just given the coding, they've just given the technology for people to voice their opinions and have a further reach than if you were just speaking in public. So I feel that you need to separate the fact that they're providing the platform and recognize that, I mean, ideally they're not trying to set any kind of agenda. So in my personal belief, I feel that these social media companies should not have any responsibility to ensure that the platform isn't being used in ways that maybe a government or a group of people would want it to be, because at the end of the day, they're not existing to pander to the views of that government or those group of people. They're just providing a technology. At the end of the day, they're a business and they're trying to make money. So I feel that there should not be any jury on who judges whether the platform is justified in regulating anything or not, because I feel that it's in the platform's best interest to just not regulate anything. And I feel that any criticism of that simple answer is not, you're not looking at from the perspective of the companies.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Rishika.
Just if a company is established because it means to give the public a platform, if it's meant to serve the public, why are we pedestalizing the country, the corporation's interest or the company's interest over the interests of the people, when dangers towards the people can be much more threatening than whatever dangers there are against the corporation?
Could I respond to that?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Because at the end of the day, the social media platforms function to make themselves money. Now, where is the money? The money is not in the hands of the people. The money is in the hands of the corporations. So I think that people should bear this fact in mind, that the social media corporations' goal is to make money, and they should treat them accordingly like they would treat any other corporation. You don't criticize, I mean, like, you should not criticize a company for making money as an incentive, because at the end of the day, that is what most companies do.
Just one tiny response. Yeah, I completely recognize that corporations are profit driven. That is how things are. But politics is also about how things should be. And I mean, that's a whole other conversation, like profit versus welfare. But yeah, I just think that it's important to bring that up.
Yeah, I think fair. So let's look at the next question. It says that, what's your take on politics and its effect on mental health? Interacting with people who are on extremes of the spectrum can be quite taxing. I personally agree with this question. There are a lot of times I've gotten into debates with people where it just gets to a point where I'm like, okay, fine, I like just can't go on with this. Does anyone have any views on it? Let's hear Sumuk, Anjali, and then Rishika.
I think it can be looked upon both approaches. So I think if you have people who have an open mind, I think it's easier to start a conversation and at least debate. So for example, I don't think having such a conversation with such a diverse group is going to have mental taxing on me. I don't think it's going to have an impact on my mental health. But say suppose you're in a hardcore environment where you're very competitive in nature, because if you look at it, take the example of the BJP or the Congress itself, the two major national parties. You need to understand that for hardly 500 seats across India, you have maybe 10 crore, 15 crore volunteers fighting for that 500 seats. So it's tougher than getting into Harvard or IIT if you look at it that way as well, because everyone's a political expert or an armchair expert. So I do believe that politics as a career is a very hard space, because there's no room for, say, being complacent or being, say, so-called weak, because on a compassionate ground or on a human ground, you can say that, oh, look, we have to respect each other's opinion. We shouldn't go to such an extent. But I do believe that when it goes into a real scenario where you're fight, because politics is also about survival. They're not there to make it. It's, see, if you're a lawyer or if you're a doctor, it doesn't change after every 5 years. You're always a lawyer or a doctor as long as your license or your degree allows you to be. But in case of a politician, it's a 5-year program. You are elected and you're out as soon it's 5 years flash by. So I think there's no space for you to be very compassionate. I think you can respect your opposition over there, but I don't think you can extend that to, say, more of a friendship. I think it's very rare you see a friendship across the extremes. You don't see a left-wing patriarch or a right-wing leader coming together and going hanging out or something. I don't think you see that. So I think it's a very hard space. It's a reality. You have to face it. So as long as if you take the example of New Zealand, hardly 20-30 lakh people are there, and I don't think there's enmity or friction between the two major parties over there, because everyone's civilized over there. There's not much at contention. But when you have a large number of people competing and when you have such a large vote bank, I think things get real. And that is why in India, at least, it's not my personal belief, but I believe that the hard space of politics will continue as long as democracy is there. It's historical as well. In monarchy, people used to kill each other, but now they're just hard on you.
Fair enough. Let's hear what Anjali has to say.
Yeah, I know we're falling short of time, so I'm going to keep it short so Rishika can also go after this. But I think one thing I've learned over the past year especially is the importance of empathy. I agree that, talking about politics and, engaging with opposing views can be extremely taxing. But I think if you try to understand where that person's coming from, it'll go a long way. Because, for example, it wasn't until my teenage years that I understood that, gender and sexuality comes on a spectrum. Okay, I didn't know that saying something such as the math test raped me is problematic, right? It was because I was privileged enough to go to or to go to school, okay, to engage on social media, to read articles, to subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, for example, right? When I read different opinions and I understood that, hey, I was social institutions around me conditioned me to think this way, but that's not right. But not everybody is privileged in the same way. So that's one thing I think you should always keep in mind when engaging with differing views. And two, I'm just going to share this one quote that I live by: direct your anger at institutions, not by the people who have been failed by them. And third, and also important, it's okay to take breaks. I know social media, for me especially, sometimes when I go on Twitter or Instagram, it can be extremely toxic. So I take breaks. I'm just like, hey guys, I'm going off social media for 7 days or 14 days, and I think that's okay for you to do.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point, that taking a break while you're getting into something is so important, especially when you're very engaged in something. Taking that break is extremely important. Let's hear Rishika, but very quickly.
Yeah, I just think Sumukh can back this up when I say that yes, social media is toxic and it's polarizing and everyone's fighting with each other. But I cannot state how different the reality, grassroots politics is different from what you see on social media. Please voice your opinions, share stories, share resources, do the most you can, but realize that often things that are ideas and opinions for us are actually the lived experiences and the lived reality for many people on the grassroots. So when we say that looking at people disagreeing with me is emotionally exhausting, it's true, but it comes from a place of privilege. We're having this Zoom conversation with a largely urban audience who has an internet connection. The people I claim to represent aren't even going to listen to this because they cannot. So it's really important to recognize that, yes, engage on politics on your own terms, prioritize your mental health, but recognize your privilege, recognize your identity, recognize the kind of spaces you are entering, and just look at the grassroots, look at the work being done as much as you can, because there is such a stark difference.
I think we're very short on time, so we're going to stop here. I'm very sorry we couldn't go through all of the questions, but just a quick thank you to everyone who logged in today and all the panelists.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tia, for moderating this session. And also a big, big thank you to our panelists, Rishika, Sumukh, Anjali, and Rahul. Today's discussion has been extremely insightful. We have gotten to understand, or rather, we have explained to our audience the various political beliefs people our age hold, how it's diverse, but at the end of the day, we all respect each other. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from this session. We've had four of our panelists with their own different views, but they've come together for the last hour and a half and respected each other's views and held a conversation in a meaningful and effective manner rather than just resorting to the sort of polarized stuff that you often hear in the media, or saying things with no concrete evidence, no concrete basis. So it has largely been a meaningful discussion. I thank you for that. Thank you so much for attending this BIC session. We will surely be back with more. This will also be made available as a recording, so please do share it with people if you found this session interesting. And most importantly, do attend more of these events. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you, Tia. Thank you, Sanjay. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.